Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. I think most would agree that when it comes to power tools, table saw is the most central piece in your shop. It's also the most dangerous. Ask anybody that works in an emergency room. I'm going to go through and share with you what I consider to be my top 10 safety tips. Maybe these will help. Table saw is typically designed to do two primary functions. One is to rip a board. That means when you're using a fence, cutting the board parallel to the grain. The other is cross-cutting, using either this, which is called a miter gauge. It's got a piece of wood added to it, and you're cutting across the grain, or you can use some kind of a sled that sits in the miter gauge slots. That's what these are called. And again, lots of control cutting across the grain. They range in horsepower from half horsepower for the real small ones. The biggest I've used was 7.5 horsepower. And anything over even a horsepower, that's a lot of power moving that blade. It spins toward you. It's designed to cut. It does not differentiate between fingers or wood. That's why it's, I believe it's the #1 cause of emergency room visits when it comes to woodworking tools. I added them up in at least 10 different brands. And I've done that relatively safely for the last 50 plus years. I've got all of my digits. So what I want to do is go through and show you some real common, I think they're very common sense habits, methods of work that will help ensure that you never end up cutting off the wrong digit. I also want to emphasize the fact that they can't make anything foolproof. Now this is a sawstop, and it's designed with technology that stops if it touches anything that conducts electricity, including your fingers. But you still have to be smart about it. No matter what they do, you put yourself in the wrong position, you're going to get cut or get hurt. So let's start with #1 and see if these match up with the way you think. First one I'm going to suggest is one that is probably the reason why most people get hurt, and that is not paying attention. So when I'm using a table saw, all of my focus is right here. I'm not being distracted by anything around me. That means you may need to lock the door to your shop. You have little children in your home and they're going to come in not knowing what's going on, and you don't hear them and they come up behind you. Is very dangerous. So I also like to keep everything clear so I can walk all the way around my table saw, and I try to keep this area free of clutter. Try to keep things away from the table saw that are not the board being cut, so that all of your focus and attention is right here. You want good lighting. Don't do this when you're tired. A lot of folks end up going out in the shop in their after hours. If you're exhausted or tired or not at 100%, don't be around a table saw. It's not worth it. So all of your focus, all of your attention is right here at the task at hand. Don't be distracted, including loud music or whatever else. Focus and attention needs to be right here. First time I saw somebody freehand on the table saw, meaning without the aid of a fence, on a rough board, and they came in and they were just simply cutting it and doing it. And wow, crazy. There are those that do that. I don't recommend it. When you use your table saw, you need two knowns. One is this edge up against the fence needs to be known to be straight, so that when you lay it against the fence, it does not rock. It's solid. This surface needs to be known to be flat, so that when it lays against the table, it's not rocking. So I'm secure down here, I'm secure in there, and now I can go ahead and safely proceed because I've eliminated two variables. What I mean is this. Here's a board that's rough. See how rocking it is? I start cutting that, running that through the table saw. The force acting by the table saw is not only pushing forward, it's also pushing down. So I start cutting here. This is not laying on the table. This is able to move like that. Somewhere in the middle, I'm going to lose control. That's going to pull the table down. It always does it fast and hard. And usually when it does, that means it's going to put part of this board is going to get now jammed into the side of the spinning blade, and you don't know what's going to happen. So I never rip or cross-cut, at least not without an apparatus like this, where the entire board is being supported and being moved in a cradle. This you could get away with. because you have full support of it. But I would not use a crooked board like this, even with a miter gauge. I think just not worth the hassle, not worth the danger, I should say. So I always make sure my board has been jointed on the face, jointed on the edge. Then I can go through and I can accurately because I know and can expect exactly what's going to happen. Those two variables have been controlled. So rough boards like this, got to go to the jointer or the hand plane first before you bring them over to your table saw. Next tip deals with the alignment of your saw. On most saws, cabinet saws in particular, the blade is attached to something called the trunnion. That is attached to the cabinet. The tabletop itself sits on top of the cabinet. So there's an alignment process that has to occur so that your blade is parallel to your miter gauge slots. There are some less expensive saws where the blade actually hangs from the underside of the table, and that's a different story altogether. But for the most part, they're going to be where the blade and that whole apparatus is attached to the base. Top is separate, attaches to the base. You've got to go in and align it. Why do you need to align it? Well, if you're running a board, ripping a board, and that blade is not aligned with this, at some point it's either going to start burning the side of the wood, which is going to put a lot of extra pressure wanting to kick that back at you, or you're going to start pulling away from the fence. As soon as you do that, all of a sudden you're in this situation where you don't have control. Now I prefer, and I'll leave a link to another video that I did, I prefer to actually have this slightly opening up at the back. Meaning instead of it being perfectly parallel to the fence, as you go through, the board being cut is just a slight gap away from the fence, the blade, and that prevents that blade from kicking up as it's coming up around and badly scoring up the backside of the cut. Now, it's a very small amount, and like I said, in the video we'll link to, you'll see exactly how to do that. But for the most part, you want that to be parallel to your miter gauge slots, your fence also parallel, with that minor exception I just noted. If it closes in, as you start to pass through, it's going to want to catch back here and throw it back in your face, and it's just a whole bunch of things you don't want to have to deal with. So make sure, and that's depending on the quality of your saw and how many other people are using it, that's something you're going to want to check on a frequent basis. And depending on how much use it gets, it might be something you need to check every time before you actually use the saw, but definitely make sure that it does not close in at the back. If anything, it can be slightly open, more so than at the front. Question is, how tall or how high do you have your blade above the thickness of the wood? Well, there's a couple of things to consider here. Number one, if you have it so that it just barely clears, there's a lot of action of pushing this up as opposed to cutting forward. What I mean by that is this. If you have your blades really high, then the cutting force of the blade is now actually pushing down, keeping the board nice and tight to the tabletop. Of course, the danger there is you've got all that exposed blade, and if for any reason you happen to move your hand over there or the board moves, and anyway, I just don't want that much ugly blade staring at my hand. So I prefer to have it closer to, maybe 1/4 of an inch. If you keep your blade sharp, that's going to help a lot too. But remember, the lower the blade, the more the force is going to be pushing the board up as opposed to a direct action of cutting into the board. But again, safety first. The less exposed, the less chance you have. Or if there is an accident, there's far less wood that's going to be making contact with your hand. Definitely don't have it all the way up. That's just a bad move overall. This next one is really important and quite possibly could be one of the most important safety features on a saw. And I went for the first 20 years without it because of my old saw. I didn't have the original piece of equipment, so I hadn't used it, got used to not using it. Now that I have one, wouldn't work without it. It's called a riving knife, this thing right here. So it's a piece of steel. It's slightly higher than the blade. It's in line with the blade, and its single biggest function, besides not allowing the board, if in the process of ripping something, the board starts, because of internal stress, starts to squeeze in on the blade, that's going to save you. But where it really helps is when you've run your board past the back of the saw often is making contact, especially if the board starts to move a little bit. But because that piece of steel is there, that prevents the board from ever being turned like this. We used to see this quite often in the shop when I was the instructor at BYU. They didn't have a riving knife. Somebody was running a board through, pushing a square piece of plywood. They're pushing out here, or they're pushing in here. All the force is out there, and what would happen is the piece would turn like this, catch the back side of the blade. It would grab hold of it, throw it through across the shop. There'd be a big C on the back side. This prevents that from happening. If you don't have one on your saw, I would look around until you can find an aftermarket part that will work. I demand that all our guys use it in their saw. We have several table saws here. It's just such a great safety feature. Never gets in the way. It'll save your bacon more often than not. The next one's a real simple one. But, I'll start again.
Hang on.
A push stick, a good push stick, is, no, I'm going to start this. Okay, go.
Go.
I was lucky. Dale Nish taught me mostly what I know about table saws and introduced me to a good push stick. And I remember him talking about the ones that just have a little V-notch where you're holding your board like this, and said, I would never use that. So dangerous. So when I make my push sticks, I usually make several of them at once so that when they get to the point where there's not much left because they've been sacrificed running through, that's when you throw them away. And to avoid not using one because that one's been destroyed, I always make a half a dozen every time I do it, so there's always a fresh one to grab. We did a video on this, and I'll leave a link for that as well. You want a push stick that's not only safe but gives you lots of control. What I mean by that is this. When do you use it? Well, I probably suggest anything less than 4 inches. I have a habit. When I run a board through, I always have my pinky over here, and it just makes me aware of where the rest of my hand is. There's areas that you need to push, and I'll talk about that in another episode, or in another tip. But when it comes to moving something through the table saw that's narrow like that, that's when you want a push stick. I need something back here to catch it. I'm not going to rely just on friction, but I want the rest of this to lay and make contact. That way I can put downward pressure with my hand, keeping this tight to the fence. And through most of the cut, I'm using my other hand here, again, to push off in this direction, countering the force coming from the table saw. But because this reaches out over a good portion of the piece of wood, I've got lots of control, and I know where the piece is going to go, I know how it's going to behave, and I can clearly and safely pass through the blade without a problem. And remember, this is sacrificial. Don't worry about cutting your push stick. That's the reason why it is designed to be eaten up, used up, and replaced when needed to be. I'm surprised how people can go in and buy a table saw, receive no instruction whatsoever, and go home and start using it. No wonder so many people get hurt with it. So this may seem like, oh, of course everybody knows that, but not everybody does. The piece you're keeping is the piece that's always going to be against the fence. So if I need a board that's 4 inches wide, I'm going to set my fence for 4 inches, and I'm going to run it through. This is the piece I keep. This is the offcut. One reason is simple. As you get near the end, sometimes the last little bit will leave a little tab of wood on the offcut piece, but on this piece, it's going to pass all the way through, and that's going to give it to you nice and clean. You always want to make sure that there's nothing that gets trapped between the blade and the fence that isn't under the control of either your hand or your push stick. You don't want to create any missiles having pieces fire back at you. Of course, the more you use your saw, the more familiar you're going to get with it. The more you use your saw, the more you're going to know what's going to happen at any given time. I prefer to have a saw that is more powerful than weak. The reason is, if I know it's powerful, I know that blade is going to continue to move, no matter what. So start over. I remember teaching at Anderson Ranch, or assisting at Anderson Ranch back in the late 80s. And we often had students that were coming there for the first time. And there was a person that was cutting a piece of wood through the saw. And as they were moving it through, at some point they got scared, whether it started to vibrate a little bit. I don't remember the exact reason. But halfway through, they threw their hands up like this, leaving that piece of wood trapped between the fence and the blade. And of course it went firing off, fortunately, to the left. You have to maintain control all the way through. I prefer to have a more powerful saw than a weaker saw. I want to know that that blade is going to continue to spin no matter what. At least now I know who my enemy is, and I don't have to worry about whether or not that's going to stall or jam and stall, but still be under power. It's going to continue to move regardless. So I know I have to maintain control. I've got to keep this board tight to the fence. I've got to keep it tight to the table, and I've got to maintain control and sufficient force to keep that board moving, go all the way through and clear that blade before I let go of anything. Not doing that is just, you're asking for trouble. You cannot leave a piece unsupported with the blade forces acting on it, and it's going to do whatever it wants to do, and you don't know and never know where that piece is going to end up. So maintain control through the entire cut. One of the unknowns in woodworking is what internal stress is in that board and how is it going to be released as I start to cut into it. And you don't do this for very long before you find out that that actually happens. You'll be making a cut and all of a sudden that board starts to close in on your saw, and then it starts to smoke and all kinds of different forces start acting on it, and you can panic easily. Well, one of the nice things about this saw is that if you do get in a situation, there's a paddle switch right here by my knee, and it's really easy to trigger that so I can shut that saw down and not have to worry about it. You never want to try to stop in the middle of a cut and then back up. You want to keep on going through. If it's impossible to keep on going through for whatever reason, hopefully you've got some kind of a mechanism that you can shut that saw down, let it stop completely before you then try to retrieve or pull back or do anything in and around that blade. I want to wrap this up talking about tips with using the table saw to cross-cut. There is a rule that we live by, and that is when you're cross-cutting, you want more surface area along the fence than across here. Meaning, in this setup, I have far more surface area here than I do along here. That does not make for a very stable move. However, if I'm ripping it like this, I've got a lot more surface area against the fence than I do here, so that's fine to push that through. If you need some support, you have two options. For the most part, you have what's called a miter gauge that slides in the slot, and this head can be rotated in different angles, and you can come through and you can actually support the workpiece as you're pushing through. Now, you want to be careful that you don't trap something between the fence and the blade on this side. In other words, I wouldn't want to be doing something like this. If I wanted to make repetitive cuts and I wanted to use my miter gauge, my fence, then what I would do is I would put an auxiliary fence on here so that this is well supported. And you can go ahead now, and even though some people think this is dangerous, it really isn't. If this is supported, screwed to the miter gauge, as you pass that through, this is going to continue to move that right on beyond the blade, and you're perfectly safe. I prefer to take the time and actually make a sled. The reason is the sled rides on both slots. The entire piece is moving along with the sled. So whatever I'm doing here in terms of using that for the proper length, I can have a hand on either side. I pass this all the way through. I get beyond the blade before I take the pieces out. It doesn't take a lot of time. We've got a video where we show you how to make these. You want it to be not want any side-to-side slop, and when it eventually gets beat up, this groove gets too big just because of run out in the blade, well, it's time to replace. But this, I think, is a far better solution for cross-cutting even large pieces. This is the one I use most of the time, but I have another one down here that I keep that is much larger, and I can cut pieces 24 inches wide. Covers a big portion of the table and provides me with lots of support. In closing, I'm going to do a free commercial for sawstop. I'm not sponsored by them. I don't get any consideration from them. I think they're a great company. They've always been very responsive whenever we've had any kind of an issue. But the tool that they've made is the safest that you're going to find. If you're not familiar with it, you just need to know this. When that blade is spinning, anything that touches it that conducts electricity, whether it's a piece of aluminum, a wet piece of wood, or human flesh, is going to cause that blade to stop within a very small portion of a rotation. It stops it and drops it out of sight, such that if you were to put your hand into that blade spinning, it would barely go through the first layer of skin and might require a Band-Aid instead of an amputation. It also has some wonderful features in that you have this big paddle switch, safety switch right there, so if you're in a jam, you can easily hit that with your knee and shut it down. You have a huge tabletop. Now they have several different models, but this is the industrial model. The professional is the same. You have a nice, great big surface. Everything is accurately milled. I've taken mine apart and looked at it. It is built like a tank. It's extremely just well manufactured. Minimum vibration, if at all. The fence that they use on it is as solid and accurate as you're going to find. It's easy to get at. They've got great power transmission between the motor and the belt. It's just everything that you could possibly think of to make a saw better, they've done. So kudos to Sawstop. I think they make the best saw on the market. And I would tell anybody looking to buy a table saw, regardless of the cost, you're better off to save your money until you can buy one of these than to risk the danger of working with anything that does not have the safety features included on this saw. Either way, Sawstop's the most important piece of equipment in your shop. Get a good one, get used to it, get comfortable with it, and be careful when you're using it. Good luck. If you like my work and enjoy my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos and help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the link below, the chisel and plane icon, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our online and in-person workshops.